What happens when the most powerful man in the world locks himself away on a cliff surrounded by endless sea? Not glory, not wisdom, but whispers so foul, Rome itself shivered to repeat them. In the ruins of Capri, shadows still carry his name. Tiberius, an emperor who ruled with silence and whose legend is written in fear, corruption, and blood. Tonight we uncover the darkness he left behind. Dare to watch, dare to question, and if you think you can handle the truth, subscribe before the story consumes you. When Rome buried Augustus, the first emperor, the city looked for strength in his successor. That man was Tiberius Claudius Nero, a general seasoned in war, but never hungry for the throne. He had commanded armies, crushed rebellions, and led campaigns with a precision that made him one of the sharpest military minds of his age. Yet, when the crown of the empire was forced upon him, he did not wear it with pride. He wore it like a chain. From the beginning, Tiberius was an emperor who ruled not with warmth or charisma, but with distance. He was the shadow after the son of Augustus, a colder, darker figure whose reign would always be marked by unease. Rome expected another golden leader. Instead, it received a ruler who avoided the spotlight, who mistrusted the Senate, and who seemed to govern as if he despised the very city he commanded. Tiberius did not enjoy the cheers of the crowd. He did not relish standing before the people in triumphal robes. He preferred silence, control, and observation. And in that silence, whispers began to grow. The Romans wanted a father of the nation. What they saw was a ghost haunting the Palatine Hill. His coldness was not an act. It was bred into him by betrayal and loss. His own mother, Livia, had manipulated the succession, bending the future of Rome to her will. Tiberius was married off to strengthen alliances, forced to divorce the woman he truly loved, so that Augustus's bloodline would seem more secure. That wound never healed. It hardened him. It made him distrustful, bitter, and deeply suspicious of affection. Those who smiled at him, he believed, smiled with knives hidden behind their backs, and in the ruthless theater of Roman politics, suspicion was often justified. Senators schemed, generals plotted, and allies turned traitors at the scent of opportunity. Tiberius saw conspiracies in every corner, and perhaps there truly were conspiracies everywhere. In a world where survival meant crushing enemies before they could rise, paranoia was not madness. It was self-defense. But the longer he ruled, the sharper that paranoia became, until it consumed him entirely. The people of Rome noticed his absence. They spoke of an emperor who did not wish to be seen. He delegated ceremonies to others. He vanished from the games. He walked in shadows through the palace, avoiding the roar of the mob. To the common citizen, he was not a man of flesh and blood, but a figure carved from ice, present, powerful, yet chillingly unreachable. Whispers began. Does he love Rome at all? Or does he rule us only because fate demands it? In truth, Tiberius did love Rome, yet it was a twisted love, the love of a master who cannot trust his own household. He strengthened the empire's borders, filled its treasury, and left behind military victories unmatched by many who followed him. But his achievements were drowned beneath the weight of his personality. To Rome, he was not a savior but a shadow looming over the Senate, watching, listening, judging. The seeds of cruelty sprouted slowly. Tiberius had learned from Augustus the art of restraint, but he had also inherited the brutal logic of survival. When betrayal came, as it always did, his punishments were merciless. He executed rivals without hesitation. He exiled senators whose loyalty seemed unsteady. The more he lashed out, the more enemies he created. The cycle of suspicion and retribution tightened like a noose. To the historian, he becomes a tragic figure. To the storyteller, he becomes a villain. Imagine the marble corridors of the Palatine Palace senators stepping carefully, speaking softly, knowing that, at any moment a word out of place could be twisted into treason. Imagine an emperor seated alone in the torchlight, reading reports of conspiracies, his eyes narrowing, his lips curling in silent rage. Rome's ruler was also Rome's prisoner, trapped by fear, by ghosts of betrayal, by the paranoia he himself fed every day. The empire thrived, yet the emperor decayed. His reign was orderly, but his spirit was collapsing, and when his trusted ally, the Praetorian prefect Sejanus, began to rise in influence, the seeds of paranoia bloomed into something darker. Sejanus was not just a soldier, he was a manipulator who exploited the emperor's cold detachment. He became Tiberius's eyes and ears, his voice in the Senate, his executioner in the city. And as Sejanus tightened his grip on Rome, Tiberius drifted further into the shadows. The emperor no longer wished to face the city that both revered and despised him. His absence became his legacy, his silence became his language. And the more silent he grew, the louder the rumors became. What kind of ruler hides from his people? What darkness drives a man to turn away from his throne? The answer, perhaps, was already forming. Tiberius was not simply withdrawing from politics. He was retreating into himself. He was a man who trusted no one, who saw betrayal in every smile, who carried wounds too deep to heal. To such a man, power was not glory. It was poison. Every day on the throne was another day of suspicion, another day of watching shadows move against him. In the eyes of Rome, he was no longer a man. He was a phantom of the Palatine, a ruler glimpsed rarely, spoken of often, feared always. The senators trembled at his decrees. The citizens gossiped about his solitude. And behind it all, the emperor himself sank deeper into bitterness. This was the Tiberius who would abandon the capital. This was the emperor who would flee to Capri, to a palace on the cliffs, where sea and stone would protect him from the world he hated and the city that whispered against him. But leaving Rome did not silence the whispers, it made them louder. Because when power hides, the imagination of the people takes its place, and in that imagination, Tiberius began to transform, from cold ruler into monster, from emperor into legend, from man into shadow. Thus begins the story of Tiberius the Perverse, not with cruelty on Capri, but with the shadow that had always lived inside him. The island of Capri rises from the sea like a jagged tooth, its cliffs sheer and merciless, its waters deep and unwelcoming. To the casual traveler, it might seem a place of beauty, a paradise of blue horizons, sunlit coves and limestone arches, but for those who stood beneath its towering rock faces in the 1st century, Capri was no paradise. It was a fortress, a prison, and in time, a stage for some of the darkest legends Rome would ever tell. When Tiberius turned his back on the capital, Capri became his chosen sanctuary. The island was distant enough to shield him from the intrigues of the city, yet close enough that his orders could still reach Rome with terrifying speed. To the senators left behind, his retreat was a mystery. Why would the emperor abandon the marble heart of empire for an island battered by storms? But to those who knew Capri, the answer was written in stone. Atop the highest peak of the island, where cliffs plunged hundreds of feet into the sea, Tiberius built his refuge, Villa Jovis. It was not a villa in the gentle sense of the word. It was a palace of dominance, its walls sprawling across the mountaintop like the bones of a beast. Great cisterns collected rainwater, feeding the fountains and baths that filled its echoing halls. Guard posts lined the edges, their watchmen gazing out over the endless waves. The sea itself was his moat, the cliffs his walls, and the winds his ever-present sentinels. Visitors approaching Capri would have seen little welcome. The island's jagged silhouette loomed above them, its white cliffs gleaming like the fangs of some ancient predator. Those summoned to Villa Jovis by imperial order understood at once. This was no retreat for leisure. It was a stronghold, a place where one entered at the emperor's will, and where leaving depended entirely on his mercy. Inside, the architecture was a reflection of its master. The palace was magnificent yet cold, vast yet suffocating. Long corridors stretched into shadow, lit only by torches that sputtered against the damp sea air. Courtyards opened suddenly to the sky, where storms lashed at the walls and the cries of gulls echoed like lamentations. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below was constant, like a drumbeat of doom, reminding all within that escape was impossible. At night, Capri became a different world. The horizon was swallowed by black water, the stars obscured by storms. The flicker of firelight from Villa Jovis could be seen from ships passing below, a spectral glow high above the waves. Sailors whispered of strange cries carried on the wind, of shadows moving along the ramparts, of an emperor who no longer belonged to the world of men. The island itself became an accomplice to the rumors that followed him. Yet Capri was not only isolation. It was power distilled. From the heights of Villa Jovis, Tiberius could watch signal fires burn along the coastline, messages flashing from tower to tower until they reached the mainland. Orders carried from his fortress still bent the empire to his will. Rome might not see his face, but Rome still felt his hand. Capri gave him what no palace in the city could: distance without weakness, invisibility without surrender. But with distance came transformation. Removed from the noise of the forum and the gaze of the people, Capri became a place where silence reigned. Silence in the halls, silence in the chambers, silence broken only by the emperor's voice or the lash of the sea outside. And in that silence, imagination took root. The further Tiberius withdrew, the more monstrous the stories became. Capri was fertile ground for legend because it was unknowable. Travelers returning from the island whispered tales of the emperor's moods, of the faces of those who went in and did not return, of the strange gatherings behind closed doors. They could not describe what they had truly seen, but in the absence of truth, invention thrived. Capri became less a place than a symbol, a cursed sanctuary where indulgence and cruelty lived side by side. The cliffs themselves fed the rumors. Sheer drops fell into foaming seas, their edges sharp and merciless. One misstep could mean death, and in the tales of Rome, those cliffs became execution grounds. Stories spread of victims hurled from the heights, their bodies dashed upon the rocks below, their screams lost in the roar of the waves. Whether such acts were real or imagined, Capri's geography gave them weight. Every visitor who looked down into the abyss could believe them. For those who served him on the island, life was a careful performance. Servants moved like shadows, speaking little, obeying quickly, their lives balanced on the edge of imperial mood. Guards patrolled corridors that seemed endless, always listening, always watching. Musicians, entertainers, and guests never knew whether their presence was an honor or a sentence. Capri taught obedience not through laws but through fear, the fear of being so close to the emperor yet utterly at his mercy. And yet, the island was not barren of beauty. Gardens bloomed in sheltered courtyards, fountains whispered in hidden corners, and from the heights of Villa Jovis the sunsets painted the sea in blood, red and gold. But even beauty took on a darker edge. The roses might bloom, but who could walk among them without wondering whose blood had nourished the soil? The fountains might flow, but what voices echoed behind the water's song? Beauty became another mask, concealing the dread that clung to every stone. To later generations, the ruins of Villa Jovis became relics of fear. Stones crumbled, mosaics faded, but the legends endured. Visitors claimed they could still feel the weight of dread in the air, still hear the echoes of whispers in the wind. The sea below still crashed with the same relentless rhythm, as though replaying every life it had claimed. Capri had become not just an island, but a mythic stage where the Emperor of Shadows played his darkest role. For Tiberius, Capri was supposed to be refuge. Yet refuge turned to exile, and exile turned to legend. He sought escape from the eyes of Rome, but in the very act of hiding, he gave the city something far more powerful than truth, a canvas for horror. Capri was his fortress, his prison, his kingdom of silence. And in that silence, the image of Tiberius as a man dissolved, replaced forever by the shadow of a monster. Rumors are living things. They crawl through corridors, seep through cracks in stone, and spread faster than fire in a city built of wood. In Rome, they were more dangerous than daggers. A whispered story could ruin a senator, topple a general, or condemn an emperor, and when Tiberius withdrew to Capri, he created the perfect breeding ground for them. The more silent he became, the louder the empire spoke. No one truly knew what happened behind the walls of Villa Jovis. The island was guarded, its halls closed, its master unseen by the public. Those who entered often did not return, and those who did rarely spoke freely. In that vacuum of knowledge, imagination filled the void. The Senate, stripped of his presence, began to paint its own picture. The people of Rome, cut off from their emperor, filled the silence with nightmares. The further he retreated into secrecy, the darker the stories became. Some rumors painted him as a man drowning in indulgence. Banquets of excess were said to spill deep into the night, not with laughter, but with grotesque amusements whispered in coded language. The island, they claimed, was no longer a palace but a theater of vice. The very word, Capri, became a synonym for corruption, a warning passed among citizens. Beware the hidden, for it festers in the dark. Others spoke of cruelty so cold it barely seemed human. Whispers told of guests brought to the cliffs only to be hurled into the abyss below, their bodies claimed by the sea. Sailors passing under the island swore they heard cries carried on the wind. Whether those voices were real or the tricks of waves and gulls did not matter. Rome believed them. Capri's geography lent the rumors a terrible plausibility. When truth cannot be seen, the imagination is free to invent. The Senate fed the whispers with careful malice. Many senators despised Tiberius, resentful of his absence and his domination. By painting him as a monster, they discredited his rule even as they obeyed it. Every order from Capri, every decree sealed with his name, was shadowed by the rumors of what he had become. His political enemies did not need swords, they had stories, and stories could cut deeper than steel. Yet the most haunting whispers were not political, they were personal. Rome began to tell tales of corruption, not only of power, but of innocence. These stories spoke of a man who, freed from public gaze, surrendered himself to appetites without restraint. The details varied, but the image remained constant: Tiberius as less than human, more beast than emperor, a figure consumed by shadow. These stories carried a peculiar weight because they thrived in shame. No one admitted to telling them aloud, yet everyone seemed to know them. The common people whispered in markets, in taverns, in the crowded baths. The soldiers muttered in barracks. Slaves carried fragments of tales from household to household, and like all rumors, with every retelling the darkness deepened. One person's suspicion became another's certainty. A senator's sneer became a citizen's outrage. A poet's metaphor became the empire's truth. By the time stories reached the provinces, they had grown monstrous, exaggerated into something beyond belief. Yet, paradoxically, the more unbelievable they sounded, the more believable they became. After all, what else could explain the emperor's strange exile? The island itself added fuel to the fire. Capri's silence seemed unnatural. The emperor was invisible, yet his presence was undeniable. Signal fires flashed from the cliffs, messengers hurried across the sea, orders reached the Senate sealed with his authority. He ruled from shadows, and the people filled those shadows with fear. It was easier to believe he had transformed into a monster than to accept that he was simply a man wary of Rome. The monstrous explanation was more compelling, more dramatic, more satisfying to an empire addicted to spectacle. Rumors do not remain whispers forever. Some were written down, committed to parchment by those who sought to preserve them as fact. Others became embedded in satire, in biting plays and venomous poetry. The emperor, who had once been known for discipline and restraint, was now remembered for decadence and corruption. Even those who never saw Capri came to believe they had glimpsed its horrors because the image was repeated so often it felt undeniable. Truth had drowned in the tide of imagination, and Tiberius himself, he did nothing to stop it. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he no longer cared. From his fortress on the cliffs, he issued orders that kept the empire secure and prosperous. Armies still marched, taxes still flowed. The machinery of empire continued without faltering. But in the minds of his people, he had already ceased to be emperor. He was legend, and not a flattering one. Every act of silence confirmed the stories. Every day he remained hidden, fed the flames. This was the cruel paradox of power. The stronger he became in reality, the weaker he became in memory. The empire he ruled flourished, yet his reputation rotted. He had retreated to Capri to escape betrayal, yet in his absence, betrayal took on a new form. It no longer wore a dagger, it wore a whisper. His enemies did not strike at his body, they struck at his name, carving it into a tale of darkness that would outlive them all. Centuries later, the ruins of Villa Jovis would crumble, but the rumors remained intact. Tourists would wander through the fallen walls, listening to guides repeat stories first whispered by senators and slaves. The cliffs would still drop into the endless sea, as if waiting for another victim, and the name of Tiberius would still shiver in the air, carried not by fact, but by the echo of lies so old they had become indistinguishable from truth. The web of rumors had done what no enemy could achieve in battle. It had immortalized Tiberius not as emperor, not as general, but as a monster in human form. And in the empire of memory, that was a fate worse than death. There is a difference between truth and what people believe. On Capri, truth drowned long ago in the depths of the sea. What remained were stories, stories that slithered across tavern benches, hissed in the Senate chambers, and whispered through marble corridors. They were not facts carved in stone, but shadows painted on the wall of history. Yet they were darker, more enduring, and far more powerful than truth itself. The allegations began simply. They said the emperor no longer dined like a man but like a god of corruption. The tables of Capri were not laid with the order of Rome, but with chaos. Guests were chosen not for honor but for amusement. Food was not the main course, spectacle was. What kind of spectacle? The rumors refused to agree, but they all agreed on this. It was not the laughter of joy that filled those halls, but the laughter of cruelty. Whispers claimed the emperor turned feasts into performances of fear. One moment, a guest might drink wine from a golden goblet. The next, they might be commanded to perform a humiliation before the silent, watching eyes of the ruler. The rooms of Villa Jovis were said to be stages where roles changed suddenly. Friend became fool, servant became prey, and no one knew what dawn would bring. The allegation was simple yet terrifying, that human dignity meant nothing in Capri's halls, and that the emperor himself delighted in stripping it away. Other stories lingered on the cruelty of the cliffs. They said the emperor used the height of his fortress as a tool, the abyss below as a weapon. Prisoners, servants, even unfortunate guests, no one was safe from the drop. The sea was an executioner, patient and impartial, waiting at the base of the rocks. Some swore they had seen the bodies from passing ships, pale shapes broken on the stones before the waves carried them away. Sailors claimed the gulls circling the cliffs fed too well in those years. Whether any of it was true mattered less than the image. Capri was a place where the ground itself could turn against you, where every step near the edge might be your last. Then came the most poisonous rumors of all. They did not speak of politics or executions. They spoke of appetites. They painted Tiberius not only as cruel, but as corrupted beyond the limits of nature. They spoke of secret chambers where daylight never entered, of acts so unholy that storytellers hesitated even to describe them. When they did, their words became riddles and metaphors, monsters, beasts, darkness swallowing innocence. The less they explained, the more powerful the image became. Rome believed these stories because it wanted to believe them. An emperor hidden away on an island, far from the public gaze, became the perfect canvas for every nightmare. The more bizarre the tale, the more convincing it seemed. How else could one explain such isolation? How else could one explain an emperor who fled from the city of gods into the arms of shadows? And so the allegations multiplied. The island, they said, was filled with chambers where pleasure and pain blurred into one. The emperor, they whispered, had turned from man into monster, from ruler into tyrant of the flesh. Each new rumor added another layer of horror, until the image of Tiberius became a mask of depravity. But perhaps the most haunting part of these allegations was their silence. No witness came forward. No record survived. No detail could be proven. Yet the absence of evidence only deepened their power. People filled the gaps with their own imagination. One senator's sneer became proof. One poet's satire became history. One gossip's tale became empire-wide knowledge. Capri was an island surrounded not by sea, but by a fog of whispers that no wind could ever clear. And behind it all, the emperor himself remained silent. He never denied the stories. He never defended his name. From his fortress on the cliffs, he allowed the whispers to breed. Was it indifference? Was it arrogance? Or was it something more sinister? An understanding that fear was the strongest form of control. For what is more terrifying, a tyrant who kills openly, or a tyrant who hides in silence, allowing imagination to invent horrors far worse than reality? The allegations became immortal. They transformed Tiberius into a mythic figure of corruption. The Senate repeated them to tarnish his name. Historians recorded them as if they were truth. And centuries later, they would still be told, not as whispers, but as fact. Capri became the island of nightmares, and Tiberius the emperor who embodied them. The line between rumor and reality vanished. It no longer mattered whether the emperor truly hurled victims from the cliffs, whether his feasts truly dripped with humiliation, whether his chambers truly hid unspeakable acts. What mattered was that Rome believed it. What mattered was that the world still remembers it. The allegations were not history, they were legend. And legends are more enduring than stone. Capri's cliffs still rise against the sky, silent witnesses to the stories carved into memory. Villa Jovis still clings to the mountaintop, its broken walls heavy with accusations. And in every ruined corridor, in every shattered chamber, the shadows seem to whisper the same chilling question: what truly happened here? The answer may never be known. Perhaps there was truth in the whispers. Perhaps there was none. But for the Romans, for the empire, and for the centuries that followed, it did not matter. The allegations themselves were enough. They shaped Tiberius forever, not as emperor, not as general, not as ruler of Rome, but as the monster of Capri. Power is not measured only in armies, coins, or laws. True power is measured in fear, and on Capri, fear became the language of the emperor. It spoke louder than decrees, cut deeper than swords, and lasted longer than loyalty. For those who lived under Tiberius, fear was not an emotion, it was air itself. To breathe was to fear. Within the walls of Villa Jovis, every movement was heavy with silence. Servants avoided one another's eyes, lest a glance be mistaken for conspiracy. Guards kept their hands near their weapons, even when nothing stirred, because nothing was more dangerous than being unprepared in the emperor's presence. Visitors walked as if on glass, each step echoing too loudly, each word weighed before it left the tongue. Capri was not a palace, it was a stage, and every man and woman upon it was an actor trapped in a play where the slightest mistake could bring the final curtain. The emperor rarely needed to raise his voice. His silence was enough, the absence of warmth, the cold gaze, the impression that he was listening to more than you said. All of this carved dread into the hearts of those around him. What made Capri so terrifying was not open violence, but the uncertainty. No one knew what would bring punishment. No one knew who might vanish next. No one knew whether the emperor himself believed the whispers that flooded his halls. The unpredictability was the terror. When cruelty follows rules, one can survive by obeying. But when cruelty is lawless, no obedience can save you. Fear extended beyond the palace walls. Messengers carried it back across the sea in their silence and their guarded eyes. When they reached Rome, they spoke little of Capri, but their silence spoke volumes. Senators read it on their faces, something unspeakable happened there. Soldiers felt it in their posture. A man returning from Capri carried shadows with him. Merchants heard it in half-formed stories told by sailors the island was cursed. And so fear traveled faster than ships, stronger than orders, shaping an empire without the emperor ever setting foot in the capital. Rumor may have created the legend of Capri, but fear gave it teeth. Fear made the rumors believable. It was not only whispered stories of cruelty that frightened Rome, it was the knowledge that those stories might be true. After all, who would dare test them? Who would risk mocking the emperor if the cliffs were waiting? In this way, fear became self-sustaining. Each person passed it on to another, not because they believed the tales, but because they dared not dismiss them. In time, Capri was seen not as a retreat, but as a labyrinth of judgment. To be summoned there was no honor, it was a sentence. Senators dreaded the imperial summons that might drag them across the sea to the island of shadows. Some never returned. Some returned broken. Their faces pale, their voices thin, their words carefully chosen for the rest of their lives. The emperor did not need to execute them to prove his power. He needed only to let them live with the memory of his silence. That memory was worse than death. Even the landscape seemed to enforce his rule of fear. The cliffs were high, the waves merciless, the sky often storm-black. The island was a fortress without gates, a prison without locks. The sea itself was the emperor's accomplice, cutting Capri off from escape, reminding everyone who lived there that the only way out was by his will, or by the fall. Visitors described the sound of the waves as relentless, pounding like the heartbeat of the island itself, a constant reminder of the abyss just beyond the walls. Fear had geography. It was carved into the very rock. Inside Villa Jovis, the emperor's presence was less man than shadow. He became a figure others spoke of but rarely saw. His invisibility only sharpened the fear. A visible tyrant can be resisted, even hated openly. A hidden tyrant becomes myth, his power stretching further than his hand could ever reach. For those on Capri, the worst question was not, "What is the emperor doing?" but, "What is he thinking?" And in the absence of answers, they imagined horrors greater than reality. That was his genius, whether intentional or not. Fear magnified itself, breeding new terrors without his effort. The atmosphere poisoned even loyalty. Those who sought to serve him best were often the most frightened, and their fear twisted into cruelty against others. To prove their devotion, they betrayed friends, accused rivals, and tightened the chains of suspicion. Capri taught that survival meant striking first, silencing others before they could speak against you. Fear did not only flow from the emperor downward, it flowed sideways, turning every companion into a threat, every ally into a potential enemy. The emperor did not need to destroy trust. Fear destroyed it for him. In Rome, fear was political. On Capri, fear was existential. It was not about losing power, but about losing identity, humanity, and the certainty that tomorrow would come. To live there was to exist in suspense, a state of waiting for something unseen, inevitable and terrible. That waiting was the weapon. The execution might never come, but the dread of it was a punishment in itself. History remembers emperors who ruled through law, through wealth, through legions. But Capri shows another form of rule, the empire of fear. It did not require armies marching in the streets or decrees shouted from the rostra. It required only silence, distance, and the imagination of those too frightened to know the truth. The genius of fear is that it governs even when the ruler is absent. And on Capri, Tiberius proved that fear could be the most enduring empire of all. Every age has its darkest whispers, tales so unsettling that they are spoken only in corners, in low voices, as if saying them aloud might summon the horrors themselves. For Tiberius, those whispers were about the children of night. The Romans did not invent subtlety when it came to rumor. They enjoyed cruelty in their satire, excess in their gossip, and venom in their accusations. But when they spoke of Capri, they often fell silent halfway through their sentences. It was as though the stories themselves carried too much weight, too much shame, to be spoken plainly, and in that hesitation, in those unfinished words, the most terrible images were born. The whispers suggested that Capri was not merely a palace of indulgence or cruelty, but a place where innocence itself was corrupted. They painted images of youth brought into the emperor's shadow, their purity shattered, their laughter turned to silence. The Romans called them children of night, not because they belonged to darkness by birth, but because darkness claimed them once they passed the threshold of Villa Jovis. Details were scarce, as they always are with rumors. Some spoke of banquets where the innocent were paraded as trophies, others of hidden chambers where they were swallowed by shadow. None could agree on the truth, but all agreed on the horror. And the lack of detail made the stories stronger, because what imagination creates is always more terrifying than what reality could reveal. The sailors whispered first. Their voices carried across harbors from ship to ship. They claimed they saw small figures led into the fortress at dusk, never to emerge at dawn. The island's cliffs, they said, swallowed more than the guilty. They devoured those who had no sins at all. And if any denied it, the sailors would raise their hands and ask, then why are the waves beneath Capri always restless, as though mourning the lost? Poets seized upon the whispers, twisting them into metaphors of decay. They wrote of gardens tended by night where flowers were plucked before they bloomed, of lamps that burned with stolen youth, of feasts where innocence itself was served as the first course. These were not reports. They were nightmares dressed in verse. But the more the poets wrote, the more Rome believed. After all, why invent such darkness unless some truth inspired it? The senators had their own uses for the stories. To them, the children of night became a symbol of corruption, proof that the emperor's retreat had not been one of philosophy or fatigue, but of monstrosity. By spreading these tales, they made his absence from Rome seem not like exile, but like damnation. He cannot return, they whispered, for his crimes are too great, even for daylight. But perhaps the most chilling element of the whispers was their tone. They were not shouted in outrage, but murmured in unease. Outrage burns brightly and then dies, unease lingers forever. The stories of the children of night spread like smoke, creeping into every house, every forum, every market, until they were no longer rumors but cultural memory. The empire began to believe not because the evidence was strong, but because the silence was unbearable. For those on Capri, the effect was suffocating. Servants who carried trays into shadowed rooms never spoke of what they saw, yet their silence was interpreted as confession. Guards who patrolled the corridors were said to hear cries in the night, though none admitted it openly. The island itself seemed complicit, its cliffs echoing strange sounds, its gulls crying like children in distress. Every element of nature conspired with the rumor until the line between story and environment vanished. Even centuries later, the legend endured. Visitors to the ruins of Villa Jovis claimed to feel an oppressive weight in certain chambers, as though the walls themselves remembered the cries they once contained. Stones do not speak, but people swore they could hear echoes if they listened closely. The imagination, once seated by rumor, did the rest. And yet, as terrible as the stories were, they may have been something else entirely: weapons. Rumors of indulgence and cruelty might tarnish a man, but rumors of corruption of innocence destroy him utterly. By attaching such whispers to Tiberius, his enemies ensured that history itself would recoil at his name. Whether or not the children of night ever existed did not matter. What mattered was that Rome believed, and that belief became more real than truth. The tragedy lies in that very uncertainty. Did the whispers describe fact, or did they reveal the darkest corners of Rome's imagination? Were the children of night victims of an emperor's depravity, or victims of a senate's hatred? We will never know. What we do know is this: in the minds of the people, the story stuck. And once a story like that takes root, it never dies. In every age since, the image of Capri has been shaped by those whispers. Tourists walk through its ruins and speak of ghosts, historians write of decadence and cruelty, storytellers linger on the shadows that never left. The children of night became more than rumor. They became symbols of the corruption of power, of the way absolute rule can devour not just nations but souls. To this day, when the wind howls across the cliffs of Capri, some say it carries a child's voice, not loud, not screaming, just a faint, broken laughter echoing over the sea. And though the world may never know if those whispers were true, the haunting remains. For truth may fade, but horror has its own immortality. Every empire invents its own language of fear. In Rome, one such word was whispered more than spoken: Spintrea. It was not the name of a people, nor a place, nor even a clear profession. It was a code, a riddle, a term born in the shadows to describe what could not be described. And when Tiberius vanished into Capri, that word attached itself to his name like a curse. No one agrees on what Spintrea truly meant. Some say it was a title for those who served the emperor in secret chambers. Others insist it was a slur, coined by senators who sought to degrade him. To the poets, it became a metaphor for corruption. To the citizens, it became a whisper of horror. What gave the word its power was not its meaning, but its uncertainty. It was the sound of shame wrapped in syllables. It was Rome's way of pointing to something too foul for daylight, and so the term clung to Capri, where the emperor's hidden life unfolded. They said the palace was filled with Spintrai, silent figures, masked or disguised, who existed only to feed the appetites of the emperor's night. Whether they were servants, prisoners, or creations of rumor hardly mattered. To Rome, they were proof that Tiberius's retreat had become a carnival of shadows, populated by beings who no longer belonged to the ordinary world. But words alone were not enough. The silence of Capri amplified them. The palace was described as a labyrinth of locked doors and windowless rooms, chambers into which no outsider entered, from which no sound emerged. Servants who passed by these doors swore the air was colder there, as if the very stones recoiled from what they contained. When asked what lay within, no one could answer, and in that absence of detail, imagination took control. The silent chambers became symbols of horror, each door a threshold into nightmares unnamed. Rome began to speak of Capri as a place where light could not penetrate. Not because the sun did not shine, Capri's skies were as bright as ever, but because the emperor had created spaces where daylight was banished. Torches sputtered, but shadows reigned. It was said that those who entered the silent chambers emerged changed, if they emerged at all. Some were broken, their faces drained of humanity. Others were never seen again. The island became not just a palace, but a machine for unmaking people. The beauty of the rumors was their vagueness. No one described what exactly happened inside those rooms. They only said it was unspeakable. That very refusal to describe made the fear stronger. To say too much would lessen the horror. To say nothing left the mind free to conjure terrors far greater. The silent chambers became a mirror in which Rome saw its own nightmares reflected. Some claimed the emperor himself delighted in feeding this atmosphere. They said he encouraged the whispers by maintaining secrecy, by allowing the word spintry to spread without denial. Perhaps he understood that fear is more powerful when it is undefined. A known tyrant can be hated, an unknown one can only be imagined, and imagination is the cruelest tyrant of all. Outside Capri, satirists mocked him with venomous verses. They wrote of coins bearing indecent scenes, of tokens exchanged like tickets to the emperor's hidden theater. These may have been inventions, but they gave shape to the shapeless, form to the formless. Every joke carried poison. Every metaphor carried fear. Soon, spintria became not just a word, but an image the emperor of Rome surrounded by shadows, orchestrating acts too shameful for the world to know. And still, the silent chambers remained locked. No scrolls record their contents, no witnesses describe their interiors. All that survives are fragments of rumor, shards of legend, pieces of a puzzle that will never be complete. Yet perhaps that is why the story endured. A puzzle left unfinished is more haunting than one solved. Capri became that unfinished puzzle, and the emperor its eternal riddle. Visitors today still walk the ruins of Villa Jovis, peering into broken rooms where the sky now gapes through collapsed ceilings. They see only stone, yet they imagine more. Guides point to crumbled staircases and say, these led to chambers where the emperor vanished. Tourists whisper to each other, wondering what lies beneath the earth, what the ruins conceal. The silent chambers no longer exist, yet their memory remains alive. The word spintria still carries unease, centuries after it was first spoken. Ultimately, the legend of the spintry and the silent chambers reveals more about Rome than about Tiberius. It shows how a society expresses its deepest fears through myth. It shows how power, when hidden, becomes monstrous in the imagination. The emperor may have done little more than withdraw into solitude, but solitude itself was transformed into spectacle by those who envied and feared him. His isolation became their canvas, and they painted it with horrors. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Capri, not what happened in reality, but what Rome believed happened. The spintry may have been real, or they may have been words flung like daggers. The silent chambers may have contained horrors, or they may have contained nothing at all. But in the end, the absence of truth became more powerful than truth itself. As the sea crashes eternally against the cliffs of Capri, one can almost hear it whispering that forbidden word, carrying it through the ages, spintry. A word that means nothing, yet contains everything. A word that, like the emperor who spawned it, has become a shadow, dark, ungraspable, and eternal. Madness does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it seeps slowly, drop by drop, until the mind is drowning without realizing it. On Capri, Tiberius did not erupt in sudden frenzy. He decayed in silence, and silence, more than anything, is where madness thrives. The emperor who once commanded legions with icy precision now spent his days wandering the endless corridors of Villa Jovis. The halls echoed not with conversation, but with his own footsteps. Servants watched him drift from chamber to chamber, pausing before empty walls as if listening to voices only he could hear. He spoke less and less to others, yet his eyes betrayed a restless storm. To those around him, it was clear his enemies were no longer senators or generals. His enemy was his own mind. The island magnified his isolation. Surrounded by cliffs, he could not escape. The sea was both shield and prison, cutting him off from the world. The horizon was endless, yet it offered no hope of freedom. For a man who trusted no one, solitude seemed a refuge at first. But solitude is a cruel companion. Days blurred into nights, nights into days, until time itself felt poisoned. The emperor became lost not in politics, but in himself. It was said he filled the silence with paranoia. Reports from Rome arrived daily, lists of conspiracies, accusations, betrayals. Whether the accusations were true mattered less than the fact that he believed them. Each message confirmed his conviction that the city despised him, that senators plotted his downfall, that shadows conspired even across the sea. Capri became a fortress of mirrors, reflecting nothing but his own suspicions back at him. The more he retreated into himself, the less human he appeared to those who saw him. Witnesses spoke of a face carved in stone, lips pressed thin, eyes sharp and lifeless. He seemed less a man than a statue animated by mistrust. When he did speak, it was often in fragments, muttered words, heavy with dread. Those who heard him whispered that he conversed not with the living, but with ghosts, ghosts of enemies executed, of allies betrayed, of family lost long ago. Ghosts indeed haunted him. His son, Drusus, long dead under mysterious circumstances, his ally Sejanus, once trusted, now destroyed in disgrace. The empire was littered with corpses of those who had stood too close to him, and their memory stalked him like phantoms through the night. He had turned survival into an art, but the cost was unbearable. Each betrayal he had crushed had carved a scar into his soul, and on Capri those scars bled endlessly. At night storms battered the island. Lightning flashed across the sea, thunder rolled against the cliffs, and rain lashed against the palace stones. Servants swore the emperor did not sleep during storms. He would pace the terraces drenched, staring into the black horizon, as if waiting for something or someone to appear. They feared to approach him, for his face in the stormlight seemed transformed, a visage twisted by fury and despair. The island's violence mirrored his own. Some whispered that he began to toy with the boundaries of reality. He demanded omens in the flight of birds, in the shape of waves. In the flames of torches, he surrounded himself with astrologers, dream interpreters, and seers, grasping at signs that the gods still watched him. That fate had not abandoned him. But even the stars offered no comfort. Their distant light only reminded him of his own distance from the world. The Romans who never saw him imagined him a beast in human form. But those who served him knew the truth was more tragic. He was not a beast. He was a man unraveling. Madness is not always violent, sometimes it is pitiful. They saw an emperor who could no longer tell friend from foe, who recoiled at shadows, who sat for hours in silence staring at the floor. Power had not strengthened him, it had hollowed him out. And yet, this very madness fed the legends. To the Senate, he became proof that absolute power corrupts absolutely. To the people, he became the cautionary tale of a ruler consumed by his own demons. Every strange act, every whispered paranoia, every vacant stare became evidence that the Emperor of Rome had ceased to be human. Capri had not only exiled him from the city, it had exiled him from himself. The tragedy deepened in his final years. He rarely left Villa Jovis. His body weakened, his skin withered, yet his mind grew sharper in cruelty. Fear became his only means of connection. He no longer trusted love, loyalty, or friendship. The only bond he acknowledged was terror. To see others tremble was to remind himself he still existed. Without fear, he was nothing. But fear cannot fill the emptiness forever. Madness gnawed at him, turning suspicion into obsession. He demanded endless reports of conspiracies, yet punished those who brought them, claiming they had invented the lies themselves. He created the very monsters he feared, then destroyed them for being monsters. The cycle fed itself, a serpent devouring its tail. Capri was the serpent's coil, and Tiberius its prisoner. When death finally approached, the island had already claimed him. He was a man surrounded by riches, by soldiers, by the machinery of empire, and yet utterly alone. His madness had built walls thicker than stone, higher than cliffs. No one could reach him, no one could comfort him, no one could tell him he was wrong. He had become emperor not of Rome, but of shadows, and shadows care nothing for their masters. In the end, the stories of his madness became inseparable from the man himself. To this day, it is impossible to know where paranoia ended and truth began. Did Capri drive him mad, Or did his madness choose Capri? Was he a victim of isolation, or an architect of his own downfall? History cannot answer. But the ruins of Villa Jovis, silent and broken, stand as a monument to the mind of an emperor who drowned not in the sea below, but in the storm within. And so Tiberius, the man who once commanded legions, became a ghost of his own making. Madness had stolen what Rome could not. The empire endured, but its ruler vanished into the abyss of his own mind. Capri kept him, and Capri never let him go. Every empire fears the moment when its ruler dies. For Rome, that fear was sharper when the ruler was already more shadow than man. Tiberius's end came not with a blaze of triumph, but with the slow extinguishing of a candle in a silent, wind-torn room. Yet even in death, the emperor of Capri left behind more questions than answers. The years had bent him. The once commanding general was now a frail figure, his skin pale, his body hunched, his strength eaten away by age and solitude. Servants described him as a ghost walking through his own palace, present but fading, as if the world was already beginning to forget him before he was gone. Yet the fear he inspired never weakened. Even as his body decayed, his shadow stretched long over the empire. In his final months, the atmosphere of Villa Jovis thickened with dread. Every cough of the emperor carried the weight of prophecy. Every fainting spell was read as a sign. Ministers waited, not for his orders, but for his death. For many, his survival was no longer desired, it was an obstacle. Power in Rome was already shifting, already searching for its next master. Capri had become not just the prison of the emperor, but the waiting room of succession. It was said that Tiberius felt the approach of death, like a storm on the horizon. He grew restless, muttering of omens and curses, speaking to those long dead. He feared betrayal, but betrayal had already arrived. In Rome, men who once bowed before his name began preparing speeches to denounce him. In Capri, attendants whispered about who might seize power once he breathed his last. Death had not yet come, but his throne was already crumbling beneath him. The stories of his final days are conflicting, as all stories about Tiberius are. Some claim he died quietly in his sleep, a tired old man whose body simply surrendered. Others claim his death was no accident, that it was hurried by those who could not wait any longer for the empire to move on. One tale speaks of a physician sent to examine him, who declared him dead prematurely, only to find him revive, gasping for breath. The attendants, terrified of a return, smothered him with blankets to finish what nature had not. Another story names his successor's allies as the culprits, eager to ensure the throne was cleared without delay. What is striking is not which version is true, but how many versions existed. The emperor who lived in rumor also died in rumor. Even his last breath could not escape the shadow of whispers. Rome did not agree on how he died, but Rome agreed on this: his death was as dark, as uncertain, and as poisoned by suspicion as his life on Capri had been. When the news reached Rome, the reaction was not mourning but release. Bells did not toll in sorrow, they rang with relief. Citizens filled the streets not to honor him, but to celebrate his departure. Some shouted curses, others mocked his memory, and a few dared to suggest the gods had punished him at last. The Senate moved quickly to denounce his name, to bury his legacy beneath layers of accusation. The emperor was gone, but the monster remained. And yet, the paradox of Tiberius's death is this: the empire he left behind was stronger than the one he inherited. The treasury overflowed, the borders held firm, the provinces were stable. His reign, judged by results, was a success, but judged by memory, it was a ruin. He had preserved the empire, but destroyed himself. He had secured Rome, but at the cost of his own humanity. His body was laid in a tomb, but his reputation was left to rot in the open air. On Capri, Villa Jovis fell silent. The torches that once burned through the night were extinguished. The corridors that echoed with dread now echoed only with emptiness. The sea, relentless and eternal, carried away the sound of his final breath, but the island was not cleansed by his absence. Its stones seemed to hold on to the memory of him, as if unwilling to let go of the shadow that had ruled them. Travelers who came after swore they felt an unease there, as if the emperor still walked the ruins, unwilling to leave the prison he had built for himself. Perhaps this was the true punishment, not death itself, but the way death was received. To be emperor of Rome was to expect glory in passing, statues erected, gods invoked, legacies praised. But Tiberius received none of it. He was remembered not as a father of the nation, but as a warning. His name became synonymous with cruelty, his retreat to Capri with perversion, his silence with monstrosity. Death gave him no absolution, it only sealed the legend. And so the question remains, was his end natural or unnatural? Did he die as a man exhausted by years, or as a victim smothered by ambition? History will never answer. What we know is that his death changed nothing about his image. Alive, he was feared. Dead, he was despised. And in both, he was alone. The cliffs of Capri still look down on the restless sea. The ruins of Villa Jova still cling to the mountaintop, battered by storms. And in those ruins, some say, the shadow of the emperor lingers. For a man who turned himself into a ghost long before death, perhaps dying was not an ending at all. Perhaps it was only the next chapter in his reign of silence. Thus the death of Tiberius was not a moment, but a continuation. His life ended, but his legend did not. The empire moved on, but the whispers remained. And they remained still, carried on the wind that lashes the cliffs. In the silence of chambers where no voices speak, in the restless sea that remembers every body it ever claimed. Tiberius is dead, but his darkness is not. Legacies are not chosen by the dead. They are written by the living, by enemies, by survivors, by storytellers who weave memory into myth. Tiberius may have ruled as emperor, but he died as something else entirely, a monster etched into the imagination of Rome. And monsters, once born, never truly die. When the news of his death spread, Rome wasted no time burying him in shame. Senators spat his name with venom, declaring that his absence was a blessing. Citizens who had once feared him mocked him openly, emboldened by the safety of his grave. He left behind an empire that was stable, prosperous, and secure, yet none of this mattered. His enemies had won the only battle that counted in the long run, the battle over memory. The stories that had clung to him during life grew sharper in death. Capri was remembered not as a fortress, but as a dungeon of horrors. Villa Jovis became less a palace and more a symbol of corruption. Every rumor whispered during his reign hardened into truth. Poets, historians, and gossipmongers alike sealed his reputation in ink. For generations, he was the emperor who turned into a beast, who ruled not by reason but by fear and depravity. And Rome delighted in the narrative. For what better warning than to show that even emperors, even men who held the world in their hands, could fall into the abyss? Tiberius became a parable of absolute power's corruption, a reminder that the gods themselves punish arrogance. His life was rewritten not as a reign, but as a cautionary tale. The ruins of Villa Jovis carried that legacy forward. Centuries after his death, travelers walked through its broken halls and swore they could feel the weight of dread in the air. The stones seemed to whisper, the sea seemed to mourn, the cliffs seemed to echo the screams of those rumored to have perished there. Archaeologists may see architecture, but storytellers see shadows. The ruins became haunted not by ghosts, but by memory itself. And so, long after his body turned to dust, Tiberius remained alive in the way all monsters remain alive, through stories told in the dark. The children of Rome were warned with his name. Do not stray, do not trust the shadows, or Tiberius will come for you. Scholars debated whether the stories were true, but to the common ear, truth no longer mattered. What mattered was that his image had been sealed forever in horror. Even as centuries passed, the legend did not fade. Renaissance chroniclers repeated the tales with relish, adding new layers of invention. Painters imagined his banquets as scenes of grotesque excess. Writers spoke of him as if he were the embodiment of corruption itself. The world may have changed, but the story of Tiberius remained the same. Not emperor, not general, not ruler, but monster. This was the ultimate irony. The man who once hated the cheers of the crowd became forever captive to their gossip. The emperor who sought silence achieved only infamy. His retreat to Capri, intended as an escape from Rome's poison, became the very foundation of his poisoned legacy. By withdrawing from the light, he allowed shadows to write his history, and the shadows wrote mercilessly. Modern visitors still feel the pull of his myth. Standing on the cliffs of Capri, one cannot help but look into the abyss below and imagine the victims said to be thrown from those heights. Walking through the ruins of Villa Jovis, one cannot help but hear whispers in the wind, as though the island itself remembers. The legend has survived longer than the empire itself. It has outlasted marble and mosaics, temples and triumphs. This is the true power of legacy, to endure beyond truth. Tiberius may not have committed all the crimes whispered in his name. Some may have been exaggerations, others outright inventions. But the details are irrelevant. History does not remember what he did. History remembers what was said about him. And in the end, perception is stronger than fact. Thus Tiberius became eternal not in glory, not in honor, but in infamy. He is remembered not as the man who preserved Rome's borders, not as the emperor who filled its treasury, not as the general who crushed its enemies. He is remembered as the creature of Capri, the emperor of shadows, the monster whose name was whispered in dread. Perhaps this was his punishment, or perhaps it was his final victory. For what monster lives forever in memory except the one who terrifies most? By becoming a figure of horror, Tiberius ensured that he would never be forgotten. And in the empire of time, to be remembered at all is its own form of power. The cliffs of Capri still stand sharp against the sky. The sea still crashes endlessly below. The ruins of Villa Jovis still cling to the mountain, scarred by centuries yet defiant. And through them, the shadow of Tiberius lingers, neither alive nor dead, neither man nor myth, but something in between. The legacy of a monster is this: long after bones crumble, long after empires fall, long after truth itself is lost, the darkness endures. And so does the name, Tiberius. In the end, the cliffs of Capri still hold their silence. The sea still crashes where whispers once drowned, and the ruins of Villa Jovis still stand like the bones of a nightmare. Tiberius may have died nearly 2,000 years ago, but his shadow has never left. History remembers emperors for their victories. It remembers Tiberius for his darkness, and perhaps that is the cruelest immortality of all, that a man can vanish, yet his legend remains, whispering forever in the night. Dare to remember and dare to subscribe before the shadows claim you too.